She had spent 3 years keeping her father alive, and he thanked her by calling her a liar in front of 14 relatives. What happened in the 5 minutes after that dinner is the reason none of them ever underestimated her again. My name is Claire Bennett, and this is what happens when the person everyone leans on finally stops holding the weight. I'm 36 years old, and I use a wheelchair. Not because I choose to, not because it's convenient, but because 18 months ago, a car ran a red light and ended the version of my life where I could stand in a kitchen or cross a room without thinking about it. My family knew this. My family watched the doctors explain it. And at Christmas dinner, in front of my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, and my own niece, my father looked at the chair I sit in every single day and said, "We're done pretending. Get up." My mother didn't argue with him. She stood, walked around the table, and rolled my wheelchair into the hallway like she was taking out the recycling. Then she looked back at me and said I could crawl if I wanted to be at the table so badly. Nobody stopped her. My brother laughed the loudest of everyone. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I picked up my phone, made one call, set it face down on the tablecloth, and waited. 5 minutes later, my father's phone rang, and by the end of that call, the smile had completely drained from his face. Before you understand what that phone call did to my family, you need to understand what I'd been doing for them, quietly, for 3 years, while they told everyone a very different story. I grew up in a house outside Denver, where my father, Gerald, ran a hardware supply warehouse for almost 3 decades. He used to call me his fixer. Anytime something broke, a leaking pipe, a jammed garage door, a fight between relatives, he'd say, "Get Claire, she'll sort it." I built my whole identity around that sentence. My mother, Diane, ran the emotional temperature of that house the way other people run a thermostat. Whatever felt too messy, too painful, too inconvenient, she simply decided wasn't happening. My younger brother Marcus grew up soft in the specific way that happens when nobody ever asks you to be anything else. He was charming, easily loved, and utterly unreliable, and everyone accepted that as simply who he was. When I became a hospital case manager at 26, my father told everyone at his warehouse that his daughter ran a whole floor of patients' lives. He was proud, and for a long time I let myself believe that pride was the whole truth, but underneath it was something colder. My father despised weakness the way some men despise the cold. When his own brother developed early-stage Parkinson's, my father called him dramatic. When a warehouse employee took medical leave, he called it a scam. I didn't know it yet, but he was writing the rules for how he'd eventually treat me. The accident happened on a rainy October night. I'd been driving back from my parents' house after helping my father through a frightening episode with his heart, his second minor cardiac event that year. On the way home, a truck blew through a red light and crushed the driver's side of my car around me. The injury left me with partial paralysis below the waist. I can transfer, I can shift my weight, I can manage short distances with bracing and effort. What I cannot do is walk across a room, and my family sat in that hospital waiting area and heard every doctor explain this in plain language. For a while, they seemed to accept it. And then, slowly, over the following year, as my father's heart condition worsened into full congestive heart failure, requiring weekly infusion treatments, something in my family quietly shifted. The version of me that was disabled became inconvenient. So they rewrote me. I became the daughter who was milking it. And Marcus, who had never once managed a doctor's appointment in his life, became, in my mother's retelling, the son who handled everything for his father. I was the one who actually did it. I scheduled every infusion appointment. I hired a home aide named Patricia, who texted me, "Never my mother," when something seemed off with my father's breathing or his color. I paid for the private hours insurance wouldn't cover, nearly $900 a month quietly on autopay, and nobody in that house ever once asked who was covering it. To ask would have meant thanking me, and thanking me would have meant admitting I wasn't the burden they'd decided I was. There was one Tuesday morning I think about often. Patricia texted me at dawn that my father looked unusually swollen around the ankles. I recognized it instantly as fluid retention, a warning sign for a man with his heart condition, and I called his cardiology office myself before my father had even gotten out of bed. They adjusted his medication that same day. His doctor told me later that catching it that morning likely kept him out of the emergency room. My father never knew I made that call. Meanwhile, Marcus would visit for exactly 11 minutes, snap a photo holding our father's hand, and leave to 40 encouraging comments online. I have the timestamps. I know precisely how long those visits lasted. That was the shape of my family for 3 years. I carried the weight, they handed the credit to someone else. And I kept telling myself that if I just stayed useful enough, my father would eventually look at me the way he used to, instead of like a problem he wanted to disown. Which brings us back to Christmas. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 10 minutes, telling myself I could turn around at any red light between my apartment and theirs. I didn't turn around. Some stubborn part of me still believed this year might be different. It wasn't. Dinner started fine. Then my father made a small comment about how I could barely reach the bread now, and the table chuckled, and I let it go the way I always let these things go, because letting go was the price of staying welcome. I understand now that swallowing that comment is exactly what told him he could go further. 20 minutes later, he set down his fork, looked directly at my wheelchair, and delivered the line that ended everything. "We're done pretending you're broken. Get up." When I told him calmly that I couldn't, that he'd heard the doctors say it himself, my mother stood up, gripped my wheelchair, and rolled it away from me into the hallway. "Crawl if you have to," she said. "We're not feeding this act anymore." And the table laughed. Not everyone. My cousin Nathan looked at his lap. My uncle Frank stared out the window, but enough of them laughed to fill the room, and Marcus laughed loudest of all. I sat perfectly still, my hands flat on the tablecloth to keep them from shaking, and I understood with total clarity that some of them wanted exactly this. They wanted to watch me drag myself across the floor to prove a point. I wasn't going to give it to them. I took out my phone. My father actually smirked, assuming I was calling someone to come collect me in tears. Instead, I dialed the after-hours line for the home health agency, and, in the flat clinical voice I use at work, I said, "This is Claire Bennett, primary coordinator and emergency contact for Gerald Bennett. I'm withdrawing from both roles, effective immediately. Please cancel this week's infusion appointments and Patricia's shifts until the family provides a new contact." Then I hung up, set the phone face down, and waited. Nobody moved to bring my chair back. That's the detail that stays with me. My father had just demanded I prove I could walk. My mother had just rolled away the one thing that let me leave, and not a single person stood up to fix either problem. It took about 5 minutes. My father's phone rang. He answered smiling, thinking it was nothing. Within seconds, the smile turned rigid. "What do you mean canceled?" he said. He looked up and found my eyes across the table, and something in his expression changed completely. "She's the what?" He lowered the phone slightly, and I heard him say, to the whole room, but really to me, "They said you're the only name on file." The room that had been full of laughter a moment earlier went completely silent. My mother's hand went to the back of a chair and stayed there, because she understood before he did exactly what this meant, that every single thing keeping their household running had quietly passed through the daughter they'd just told to crawl. My father's voice cracked as he tried to sound in control, asking about tomorrow's appointment time. And then I watched the arithmetic finish behind his eyes as the dispatcher told him the next infusion was scheduled for 6:15 the following morning, and there was suddenly no one on record who knew how to get him there. The performance drained out of his voice entirely. What was left was simply a frightened old man in a room full of relatives. "Please, Claire," he said into the phone, but it was really to me. "Please don't do this. I want you to notice something about that sentence, because I noticed it immediately." He wasn't asking his daughter to stay. He was begging his coordinator not to shut off the machine. I asked my Uncle Frank to bring my chair back. I transferred into it, braced and careful, the way I've done 1,000 times, and I rolled myself out the front door while the gingerbread went cold on the counter behind me. The drive home took 25 minutes, and for the first time in years, nobody's blood pressure was my responsibility for the length of that drive. The messages started before I even parked. My mother sent a wall of texts accusing me of humiliating my father at Christmas, furious, wounded, not a single word of apology anywhere in them. Near the bottom, one message from my father, sent later, once the house had gone quiet. It didn't say he was sorry. It didn't ask if I was all right. It said, "We need to talk about tomorrow." Tomorrow came, and it did not go well for them. Patricia, who hadn't been confirmed or paid in over a week, left me a gentle voicemail saying she couldn't keep showing up without someone telling her she still had a job. My mother spent that entire morning discovering, one humiliating phone call at a time, that she had no idea how her own husband's care actually worked. She didn't know his account login, she didn't know his appointment times. Every single number on the paperwork, it turned out, rang straight to me. They scrambled a last-minute ride that cost triple the normal rate, and my father barely made it to treatment on time. Then, the real damage started. Bills that used to disappear quietly into my account began arriving at their house instead. My mother had to admit to a scheduling nurse out loud that she didn't know her own husband's medication times, and Marcus, the family's celebrated devoted son, texted me 4 days later, asking for the name of our father's treatment clinic and a list of his medications, because he genuinely did not know either one. That message is the clearest confession I own. The man they'd spent 3 years praising for caring for our father needed me to text him the basics of a life he'd been publicly credited with running. Then came the twist I never saw coming, the one that reframed everything I thought I understood about my own family. Going back through old messages that week, I found a voicemail my father had left me 8 months earlier. On a night his heart had frightened him badly, a night the performance had slipped, and something honest had leaked out. "I don't know what I'd do without you, kid," he said on that recording, his voice small and unguarded. "Just don't tell your brother I said that." In private, on his worst nights, I was the one he couldn't survive without. In public, at a table full of relatives, I was a fraud in a costume. Both of those men were my father. I had spent 3 years loving the one on the voicemail while being punished by the one at the table, and I finally understood that his cruelty toward me had never really been about me at all. It was about something he couldn't afford to look at directly, the fact that the accident that put me in this chair happened on a night I was out there for him. I decided we needed to sit down as a family, all of us, and finally say the things that had been buried for years. We gathered in early January, 12 of us in that same dining room. I came in through the front door under my own power, and nobody rolled anything away from me this time. I laid out the visit log I keep for work habit, 2 years of dates, cross-referenced against Marcus's public photos, and watched his easy laugh die in his throat when the timestamps didn't match his story. My mother tried to seize control of the room the way she always had, accusing me of making everything about myself since the accident. I let her finish, then I played the voicemail her own voice, admitting Marcus didn't know how any of it worked, and the room went utterly silent, because the truth doesn't care whose voice happens to be carrying it. My Aunt Carol asked Marcus, quietly, to name a single one of our father's medications. He couldn't. And in front of everyone, my father finally broke and told the truth about the accident, his voice cracking as he admitted I was in that chair because I'd answered his call that night. He had known it for a year and a half and let his guilt curdle into cruelty, instead of ever saying a word. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like watching a lie my family had built finally grow, too heavy to hold itself up. I set up professional care for my father through a licensed agency, paid for honestly, coordinated by people whose only relationship to him is a contract. It costs almost exactly what my quiet, invisible labor had been worth all along, except now it appears on a bill my parents pay themselves, with someone else's name where mine used to be. My father is safe. He's cared for. I made sure of it, because that's who I am, and I was never going to let their cruelty turn me into someone who'd endanger a sick man. But I am no longer the invisible machinery holding up his entire life in the dark. Marcus and I don't speak much anymore. I don't wish him harm. I simply stopped being the floor he stood on to look tall. My Aunt Carol wrote to me weeks later and said the family should have seen what I was carrying all along, and I noticed something interesting in myself when I read it. I no longer needed to hear it. I'd already given that validation to myself. In April, I visited my father once, not as his coordinator, just as his daughter. He told me, in a steady voice, I hadn't heard from him in years, that he didn't want me to come back because he needed a nurse. He wanted to know his daughter if it wasn't too late. I sat with him a while. I didn't move back into the old role. Some things don't get repaired. They just finally get told the truth. They told me to crawl. Instead, I rolled myself out the front door and built a life they don't get to grade anymore. And for the first time in my life, I don't need anyone at that table to believe me. I know exactly what I carried, and I know I set it down on my own terms. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which moment hit you hardest. Leave it in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about the people who finally stop explaining themselves.